Here you see pictured Napoleon. Well, it's a painting, of course. Here in this painting is Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon the First. Sometimes there's a myth about Napoleon that Napoleon was short, when in fact he's actually more of an average height individual during this time period. Napoleon becomes associated with an entire age of history, the Age of Napoleon, 1799 to 1815. 1799 would be the beginning of this period because this is the time period when Napoleon, in a military coup, overthrew the Directory, the last phase of the French Revolutionary Republic government, and took power. And 1815 would be the period or the date of his final defeat in Belgium in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, one of the most significant battles in Western history, when the combined armies of the British, led by Lord Wellington, and the Prussians, led by General Blücher, defeated Napoleon for the final time. Napoleon was exiled twice, actually. The first time he was exiled to a tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean, where he then returned. And in 1815, for 100 days, Napoleon sought to reclaim the authority of the French state and reestablish the power of France under his leadership. After his defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. And it's a small island in the South Atlantic. It's very isolated, from which he would never be able to return and threaten the status quo in Europe again. And he would die there in 1821. Napoleon is a very, very significant figure for a number of reasons. First of all, Napoleon rose through the ranks of the revolution. He was himself a product of the revolution. He was from Corsica, so there was a certain level of insecurity on his part, because oftentimes the people on mainland France would not see Corsicans as fully French in some respects, and this might have contributed to an intensely competitive spirit in Napoleon. But he was a significant military player in the Revolutionary Wars that were fought during the French Revolution. After the French Revolution really took hold, you see, during the radical phase of the convention, you see a really continental war take hold in Europe as powers such as like Austria, Spain, the British, the Dutch, others sought to defeat the French Revolution and reestablish a status quo in France, because they saw the French Revolution as threatening really a massive, tumultuous event across Europe. And so the French Revolution was a significant threat for existing governments, and particularly monarchical governments. Napoleon won major victories during the revolutionary time period. And in the latter phases of the revolution, in 1797 and 1798, he waged campaigns in North Italy, where he defeated the Austrians, and even fought in Egypt, seeking to seize control of British influence from Egypt. The painting you see here is a painting depicting the famous Battle of the Pyramids, as it was dubbed. And you see the armies down here battling. These are the French armies battling the Mamluk Turks. So these were the Islamic forces down here of the Mamluk Turks. And in the background you see the famous Great Pyramids of Giza. The Battle of the Pyramids was itself, Napoleon was a master of propaganda in many respects. And depictions like this of the armies fighting under the Great Pyramids, sort of in the shadow of the Great Pyramids, would be printed on currency and would be displayed in France as a way of symbolizing the significance of Napoleon for France. It was really propaganda, though, for a number of reasons. First of all, the battle that is depicted in the Battle of the Pyramids was not sort of under the shadow of the Great Pyramids, but rather it was fought in a watermelon patch that was really not in sight of the Great Pyramids themselves. Now, Napoleon had won that battle against the Mamluk Turks, but in the longer term, Napoleon did not succeed in his attempt to conquer Egypt and eliminate British influence there. Ultimately, Napoleon waged several campaigns in Egypt, eventually leading his armies up into the areas that are today the areas of Palestine and Israel. But eventually, his army actually became infected with the plague, and this caused problems for his military. And then the British Navy came along and effectively destroyed much of the French fleet that had been used to take his army to Egypt. Napoleon then returned more or less by himself and a contingent of his officers and soldiers, and he left the bulk of his army behind in Egypt, and his next in command was left effectively to do the best he could, but ultimately to fail in Egypt. And so Egypt does not become a part of the French Empire. And instead, in the longer term, while Napoleon won some major victories there, in the longer term, Napoleon's foray into Egypt, from a actual military standpoint, was not successful. But Napoleon, a master of propaganda and politics as well as military affairs, comes back to France and presents it as a great triumph and a great victory for France. And of course, again, this sort of scene, this legend, if you will, is printed in currency in France and used as a way to sort of bolster the significance of Napoleon as doing something that was great for France, this new nation of the Revolutionary Age. Interestingly, and a little side note to the Egyptian campaign, of course, one will witness, as a result of the French foray of Napoleon into Egypt, you have some plundering of ancient artifacts of Egypt. And of course, the discovery, ultimately, of the Rosetta Stone, which was then translated by Champollion. The Rosetta Stone was the stone that was discovered that actually unlocked the mystery of Egyptian hieroglyphics, allowing ultimately for hieroglyphic script to be read and deciphered. So it was significant for other reasons as well. Today, on the site where King Louis XVI was executed, you see an obelisk of Ramses the Great, also speaking to the ultimate plunder of the artifacts of Egypt. So Napoleon doesn't really succeed from a military standpoint in Egypt, but he very much succeeded from a political standpoint. He comes back and ultimately, in a coup d'etat, seizes power and becomes the leader of France and of the French Republic. Napoleon is also associated with a sort of revolution in warfare at the time, Napoleonic warfare. And generally speaking, it's named after Napoleon because it builds on the use of artillery and of cavalry on the battlefield. Napoleon was sort of a mastermind of understanding and being able to, if you will, imagine his opponent's next move before they make it. And then he was able to use mobility to outflank his enemies and position his artillery in incredibly important ways. And so Napoleon was highly successful in his attempts at conquering Europe for a period of about a decade, largely because of his brilliance as a military mind, but also because of his ability to sort of revolutionize warfare at the time. And this led, again, to his almost complete conquest of Europe. Effectively, he conquered all of Western Europe. Though the conquest begins to unravel relatively quickly. In 1808, there's a rebellion in Spain, and Spain descends into guerrilla warfare. Eventually, in a brutal war, the forces of France were pushed out of Spain. In 1812, the army of Napoleon had to retreat from Moscow, and they suffered tremendously in the harsh conditions of Russia. And of course, eventually, after 1812, Napoleon will be exiled to the island of Elba. He will then return, and he will, for 100 days, try to reclaim his authority, only to be defeated again by the forces of the Prussians under Blucher's command and Wellington under the British under Wellington's command in the Battle of Waterloo, to be exiled in 1815 to the island of Helena in the South Atlantic, a remote island. Was Napoleon revolutionary? And what I mean by this, and you see here a painting of Napoleon in full imperial regalia, in the sort of stylings of a Roman emperor, how a Roman emperor might look. And so one has to ask the question: Is Napoleon a repudiation of the Republican experiment of the French Revolution, or is he like embracing it? Was Napoleon revolutionary? Was Napoleon destroying the French Revolution, or was Napoleon sort of carrying on the revolution? The answer is, it might seem strange, but the answer is a bit of both. On the one level, when you look at the sort of, if you will, executive level of things, it's really not consistent with, I think, a lot of the ideals of the Republican experiment that represented the French Revolution. He becomes like an authoritarian leader. He is crowned emperor. He has an empress who was also crowned as such by Pope Pius, and she was from a very elite class, an elite French class. His wife was. And no one is voting for Napoleon per se. Napoleon's really an authoritarian leader. And likewise, when it comes to other territories that Napoleon conquers and controls during this period of time, the people that run those territories are also not really people that are sort of democratically or in a merit-based way appointed to those positions. Instead, the individuals that were usually appointed for high-level positions overseeing certain conquered territories, like Spain, for example, were allies of Napoleon. They were his family members, these types of things that were appointed by himself. So on one level, when you look at the top of the Napoleonic state of the French Republic, if you will, when you look at the top of Napoleon's experiment, it doesn't seem very consistent with the ideals of the French Revolution. But when you look below that, you actually see elements of this that do embrace the revolution. For example, the civil code, or the Code Civil of the French Revolution, that was really created by Napoleon, is really a product of the ideas of the revolution in France. It was kind of a moderate version of Republican reform, and this established a very clear legal proceedings in the state of France that was much more organized and much more consistent and theoretically transparent than you would have ever seen in the medieval period. So you had like a clear codification of the law, a sort of establishment of the basic principles of governance occurred. There were separation of powers in this state. There was voting in this state. There was male suffrage in this state, and voting for a significant portion of the male population, at least, in Napoleonic France. Now, they don't necessarily vote directly. Instead, they usually voted, and the votes were probably more like a suggestion, and then the government followed that suggestion in appointing people into these positions. But people did vote in Napoleonic France. There was a sort of codified law, so a formal legal and judicial process that was set in place that was not like what you would have seen in the medieval period. There were separation of powers in different branches of government with different duties and these types of things, which was consistent with Republican forms of government. You had the establishment of the church reestablished, but the church didn't really control all of those lands. They weren't necessarily owned by the church anymore. The church was reestablished, but it was still sort of under the direction of the Napoleonic state. But then you also have the fact that Napoleon restricted freedom of speech and press, particularly as it might relate to himself, relied on propaganda. In many cases, fixed elections might have occurred. But perhaps the biggest reason here, too, though, was that because of things like the Civil Code, for example, the ideals of the revolution were extended across the continent. And so where the Napoleonic armies went, oftentimes you saw, if you will, the sort of seeds and ideas of the revolution sort of sown. And so the idea of self-government, of representative government, of sort of a more organized and fair sort of representative and judicial process in states, these ideals are sort of conveyed across the areas that were controlled, in many cases, by Napoleonic rule. And so we will see the revolutionary impulse sort of return in places like Frankfurt, Germany, for example, during the 1800s, long after the death of Napoleon, largely because of the sort of dissemination of the ideas of the revolution that occurred when Napoleon was in power.